In our previous episode, we saw Commander Walker become Captain Walker and receive command of a hunting group of sloops. We left the action on the 1st of June 1943 aboard HMS Starling. And now, the continuation. On the bridge of HMS Starling, Lieutenant Byrne, currently officer of the watch, grabbed the telephone. "Yes, what is it?" "Submarine on the surface, transmitting on bearing 225 degrees. Must be about 20 miles away, sir." That was one Archie Pitt, the high-frequency direction finding operator. In line with Walker's instructions, Byrne quickly ordered, "Port 15, midships. Steady, steer 225, full speed ahead both." Once he felt the deck rumble as Starling picked up speed, he opened the voice pipe to the captain's cabin. "Captain, sir." "Yes, what is it?" "Submarine on the surface reported by high-frequency direction finding." "Righto." Seconds later, Walker materialised on the bridge, quickly checked the situation, and got to work. "Sound action stations. Make to the group. Keep station on me. Course 225, speed 18 knots. Ships to be 4 miles apart." The second support group quickly swung out in line abreast, akin to an ancient line of galleys, as crewmen in various states of dress made the short distances between wherever they'd been at the time and their battle positions. Luckily on a sloop you never have that far to go. Wild Goose began signalling by light, have picked up U-boat on high-frequency direction finding bearing 228. Starling's own high-frequency direction finding confirmed its bearing of 225, and the navigator ran the two lines together and estimated a distance to the contact of between 15 and 20 miles. Shortly after 1000, the distance had closed, and lookouts reported seeing a vortex of water. Moments later, the ASDIC team reported a contact at roughly the same location. This, as it turned out, was U-202, making its way home with only 30 tons of diesel left. Its commanding officer had been called to the conning tower by the report from a lookout of the masts of a convoy. He'd taken a look through the biggest pair of binoculars that he had aboard, turned to the man who'd made the report, and said,
"Das sind keine Handelsschiffe, du Idiot! Das sind Zerstörer! Alarm! Tauchen!"
Or at least that was the polite version that went on the record. U-202 immediately dove to 500 feet and went silent. It was a tactic that had worked well in the past. Meanwhile, up on Starling's bridge, Walker asked the chief engineer to come to the bridge, and when he did so, he pointed to one side. "Chief, there's a U-boat out there. Kite's going well, isn't she? Watch her for a couple of minutes." Kite was drawing ahead of her compatriots. Walker was still concentrating on the horizon when the engineer vanished down a ladder, and moments later, Starling started vibrating even harder and began to claw back Kite's lead. By 10:15, Starling was decelerating as she began to stalk. The ASDIC contact was passed on to the other ships, and Walker ordered his ship in for an attack run, while Wild Goose and Kite came in close to maintain contact. During his time at Western Approaches Command and working with the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, Walker had picked up a common tactic in Atlantic Wolfpacks was for one submarine to go dormant, whilst another nearby sub set up a shot at the escort that was heading for the first sub. Just in case this was the case, he ordered Cygnet, Woodpecker and Wren to patrol around the edge of the attack zone, just in case. For the first time outside of drill, Starling hoisted the black pennant and charged. 6 depth charges went over the stern, while launchers on either side sent 4 more soaring through the sky. After a few seconds, the sea erupted behind them, and Starling swung about and trained her guns. But nothing came to the surface. Kite and Wild Goose had maintained the contact and witnessed U-202 dodge and weave like a snake in tall grass. Starling reacquired, but as more depth charges went into the sea, a pattern began to emerge. Each time it heard a ship pass overhead, U-202 would change course, and then, when the depth charges began exploding, it would change course again, making holding the contact rather difficult amidst the noise created by all the explosions. Walker tried something different, running all 3 nearby ships across the contact in a line. In theory, this should create a square of depth charges centred on the submarine from which no escape was possible. But with contact being lost several hundred yards before the drops could be made, even this seemed to do no good against the cunning U-202. Walker thus changed his tactics yet a third time, forming a V shape and slowing right down. Starling was about 1,500 yards behind the U-boat at the tip of the V and was directing the other two ships in at 5 knots. They were creeping along so as not to be heard. The first warning U-202 should have would be the splash of depth charges. This prompted a new behaviour. U-202 began randomly speeding up, slowing down, changing course and depth, and dropping numerous bubble decoys. Whilst this did keep her alive for now, Walker settled for this particular approach, as it meant that the sub was burning through its batteries and air much faster, as it had to keep moving, rather than wait for Walker to do something. The calculation he'd made was that the sub would probably try and surface just after dark to try its luck with torpedoes, and that its batteries might then have an hour or two left. The sub would therefore probably try and make a break for it on the surface around midnight when those ran out. Evening came and went, and no torpedo attack materialised. But then, 2 minutes after midnight, "Submarine surfacing, bearing green 30, sir." "Very well, star shell, commence, commence, commence." The flares of the star shell illuminated the conning tower of the sub, which was already powering ahead as it engaged its diesels. Every gun in range on all 6 sloops opened up. A 4-inch shell was seen to hit just after the conning tower, sending billows of red smoke up into the night air. More shells of various sizes began to slam home as Starling raced in to ram. The range closed below the capability of the forward guns to depress, but as the sloop approached, it became clear that the sub was in a bad way. Wanting to preserve his ship for later, if he could, Walker ordered the sloop hard to starboard, raking the sub as he passed by with the 20mm Oerlikons on the port side and sending a pair of depth charges set to shallow detonation either side of the U-boat using the port side K-guns. The charges detonated in the wake of the Starling, and the sub was seen to be bodily lifted clear out of the ocean on plumes of water. When the smoke cleared, the sub was sinking by the stern, the conning tower broken, and the crew were in the midst of abandoning ship. Starling's boats had actually already been manned and launched in the hopes of capturing the sub whilst the water was still in the air, but it was clear that the shattered vessel was already starting a terminal dive, and so the boats diverted instead to hauling survivors out of the water. 26 sailors and 4 officers, including the commanding officer, were rescued and then held aboard the boats until the identity of their sub had been ascertained. Then they were hauled aboard Starling and Wild Goose and the wounded taken to the ship's doctors. Thanks to their efforts, only one of the German sailors would succumb to their wounds. After thanking Captain Lieutenant Gunther Purge for what he described as an excellent bit of group training, Walker ordered his ships to splice the main brace. The group then headed back to Liverpool, lending the prisoners an accordion, which one of the U-boat crew played with some skill, leading his fellows in a number of German songs which were appreciated by the crew for their cadence and tone, if not for their ability to actually understand a word of what was being said. Upon arrival, to much congratulations, Western Approaches Command tabulated the results of the voyage as follows. 1. The creeping attack, and the variations of it devised by Walker on the day, were shown to be a powerful new tactical weapon under action conditions. 2. Nevertheless, U-boats could dive deeper than the current set of depth charges could be set to explode. Nearly 4 years after the start of the battle against them, the escorts still did not have a weapon capable of destroying a U-boat at its maximum dive depth. 3. Time was essential to make quite certain of a kill. 4. There were some signs that German morale was weakening. This last had come from interrogations of the submarine's crew, some of whom it turned out had been less than thrilled to be assigned to the U-boat corps. It also emerged that quite a number of Walker's attack runs had actually been perfectly spot on, but U-202 had been taken down eventually to 820 feet, which was 120 foot past her test depth, and that had given her a 300-foot cushion of water between the hull and a depth charge even on its deepest setting, even if it exploded directly above the sub. Ironically enough, Walker's son Timothy had just gone to sea aboard the submarine HMS Parthian, headed for the Mediterranean. The loss of U-202 capped off a disastrous time for the Kriegsmarine's U-boats. During the month of May, they'd lost more U-boats in 31 days than they had during the whole of 1941, and almost half as many as they'd lost in the entirety of 1942. Having reprovisioned, Walker's ships learned that they'd been assigned to a new area, the Bay of Biscay. This was the primary transit route for U-boats heading to and from the Atlantic. Coastal Command had gradually been putting more and more aircraft over the area in a bid to force the U-boats to remain submerged, which would slow down their passage and occasionally allowed the aircraft to pick one off. Long-range Junkers 88s had tried to stop the Liberators, Catalinas and Sunderlands, and this often led to epic dogfights in the skies as multiple multi-engine bombers and flying boats tried to pick each other off with a variety of fixed, turreted and pintle-mounted machine guns and cannons. For the crews of Coastal Command, this was exceedingly dangerous work. There were no Allied ships in the area, and the chances of being picked up if shot down at all was slim. The seas were usually fairly rough and empty, and in the rare event that a ship showed up, it was almost certainly going to be German. Now, though, even more resources were brought in on the Allied side. Second support group would be sent out in late June. The bay had been divided into two broad operational zones, musketry and sea slug, and the second was to sweep the former in concert with Allied aircraft. Anything on the surface would in theory be found and then either sunk or forced to dive by aircraft, and anything that dove could be hunted by the second. HMS Signet and Starling were missing, the former having been reassigned to another escort group. The latter was completing some minor repairs and would follow a few days later. Walker therefore temporarily sailed in Woodpecker. As well as another support group which was operating in the Sea Slug area, squadrons of mosquitoes and bowfighters were being deployed in numbers, not just to spot and harass U-boats, but to turn the tables on any German aircraft that might try and interfere. Starling ended up having a little adventure of its own on its way to catch up. First, it ran into a storm which flattened the breakwater. Then an ASDIC contact actually turned out to be a wreck. They only discerned this when they dropped a depth charge attack, which yielded wreckage in the form of many, many dead eels. A random empty landing craft was encountered and sunk by gunfire, and then a chase after a submarine, which had been reported by an aircraft, found them unintendingly sailing through a minefield. Finally, a search for a dinghy from a shot-down aircraft likewise proved unsuccessful. Further south, the first few days of the joint operation had proved rather frustrating. This kind of close coordination between aircraft and ships had not really been tried before, at least in this role, and working out if an aircraft's report was actually a U-boat or just a bit of flotsam, or was even in the right position, had proved somewhat irritating. One aircraft had radioed that it was definitely a U-boat, and it was in fact circling the U-boat and could see the conning tower, the hull and everything, but gave a position that, once it was plotted on the charts, apparently told them that there was a U-boat circling the town of Chambly, which is a few miles north of Paris and mainland France. Thus, on the morning of the 24th of June, the crews of the second were a little bit tired and settling in for another long day, when suddenly the ASDIC operator reported that a submarine had been contacted 1,000 yards ahead, along with a somewhat weird whistling noise. Action station sounded, Walker vaulted up a ladder to the bridge, and the officer in charge of the depth charges, who had been lowering himself into a bathtub, made for his action station at full speed, pausing just long enough to wrap a towel around his waist, which would be his primary battle dress for the next little while. Starling leapt forward, and the first pattern of depth charges dropped, hoping to catch the submarine by surprise. The water astern fountained up, and the ship began to swing about for another pass, when suddenly everyone started to look aft. The spray from the depth charges was still in the air as a U-boat surged upwards from the depths. As Walker recorded, For the enemy to surface in the exact spot where the eyes of the whole group were concentrated at the first conceivable moment after the pattern was fired gave such a copybook result that one felt momentarily a sense of disbelief that this was happening. The sub, for some reason, now decided to make a break for it on the surface, and the sloops came alive with gunfire. A forest of shell splashes erupted all around the sub, and its bow started to dip. Apparently the captain had realised that this method of escape perhaps wasn't going to work as well as he thought. Walker ordered Starling in to ram and signalled the other ships to cease fire. Someone in the flotilla got the message a little bit late, and a shell screamed off of Starling's bow, taking the bullring, a deck-mounted steel frame through which anchor and mooring cables can be run, with it. Walker blinked, raised an eyebrow, and pressed on. Starling then caught a particularly large swell at the very last moment, which lifted her up and over the U-boat. And so, instead of being knifed in the ribs by the ship's bow, U-119 became the unfortunate recipient of a 1,400-ton elbow drop, the ship's momentum then carrying it forward amidst a scream of tortured metal as the sub was rolled over by the friction. The sub then went completely inverted and began to sink as the air rushed out of the ballast tanks to be replaced by water. Luckily, this ensured that Starling's screws weren't hit. As the sub passed by the depth charge rails, the towel-wearing John Filluel sent a shallow pattern astern after it just to make sure. However, he hadn't counted on the fact that Starling had been significantly slowed by the collision, and she didn't quite get out of the way in time, and she then leapt into the air as the depth charges went off, taking with them every light bulb on the ship along with much of the crockery. Woodpecker was actually sweeping in to finish off the sub anyway, whilst Starling tried to assess the damage. The bow was bent at 30 degrees, the Aztec dome had been scraped off by the submarine's passage, and either the impact or the depth charge explosion, or both, had caused flooding in the forward magazines and in various other areas. The crew then set about emergency damage control as the bow settled by about 3 feet, and it turned out Starling could only limp along at about 10 knots. Nearby, Wren and Wild Goose had detected another U-boat closing in, presumably trying to get revenge. The operational ships in the group did their best, but it seemed to have little effect. Walker determined they were probably attacking bubble-maker decoys and summoned Wild Goose alongside, transferring over and taking command, swapping with Commander Weems, who now had to try and keep Starling afloat and get her pointing vaguely in the direction of home. Walker brought half a dozen key crew members across with him and quickly established that the new sub was using a similar tactic to U-202, going very deep, which meant that Aztec lost contact rather sooner on the attack run than if she'd been shallower, and the sub was then using this time plus the depth to evade the worst of the barrages of depth charges. Walker quickly organised his creeping attack, first using one ship with a string of depth charges, and then several firing as many as they could. This slow-speed operation would only work if the depth charges were set to maximum depth. Otherwise, the sloops would be going far too slowly to evade damage by their own weapons. Although thus far hard to hit, U-449 was brand new, and her captain was also on his first patrol in command. It seems that, unlike the more experienced U-202, which was prepared to really push the envelope, he'd probably stuck to the submarine's test depth or close to it. And so that afternoon it seems that she took as close to a direct hit as you could reasonably expect to get from a depth charge, the wreckage that bubbled up in the aftermath of that particular explosion being a complete mess, and clearly more the result of a violent explosion than an implosion. Starling was limping home further to the north, in considerable danger not just from possible bulkhead failure, but from more U-boats, whose primary transit lane she had to cross to get back to Plymouth. They were thus alone when the second splice the main brace signal of the day came through, preceded by a personal message. To Starling from Captain Walker. Goodbye, my gallant Starling. God be with you. A few hours later, detached after confirming the destruction of U-449, HMS Kite caught up with and then escorted Starling most of the way to Plymouth, handing her over to a Hunt-class destroyer that had been dispatched from the port to lead her in the rest of the way. Starling proceeded at somewhere between 10 and 12 knots, sighting the Bishop Rock Lighthouse on the 26th of June. The chief engineer looked at the clock and realised there was an outside chance that they might make it into port before the pubs closed if they could pick up a bit of speed, and soon Starling, damage or not, was doing 14 knots, motoring on past the bathers on the breakwater to some amusement as she was heavily down by the bow with the stern up in the air and the tips of the propellers thrashing in the open, but proceeding apace amidst a huge bow wave like an especially determined bloodhound, at least if bloodhounds could track at sea. They hauled up alongside the Devonport South dockyard, rapidly handed over the ship to the dockyard workers and their large pumps, and then leave was piped at 8:30 in the evening, and a mad rush for the pubs almost toppled a few of the dockyard men off the gangways. Walker and the rest of the second would arrive 4 days later, having run low on fuel, having not encountered any further U-boats, and arriving at a somewhat more sedate pace. Walker then set about prioritising Starling's repairs, and found Lieutenant Byrne, who lived in Kingston-upon-Thames, on the outskirts of London, and offered him a first-class sleeper compartment on the next train to leave the port, along with an additional day's leave and a taxi from the station in London to the Admiralty, and then back to his home, if he would take Walker's official report with him. That was an offer that didn't really need repeating, although Byrne found himself using some of his additional leave sitting in front of a lot of gold braid recounting the attack on U-119 almost blow by blow. With Starling needing more than a few days' work, Walker decided to head back out to the Bay of Biscay on the 3rd of July whilst remaining aboard Wild Goose. But this patrol netted only some survivors from U-607, which had been sunk by a Liberator who'd then dropped a life raft nearby for the survivors. Walker suggested, instead of aircraft and ships operating separately and only really communicating when they had something to say, the aircraft should instead be assigned to the support groups and spiral out from the ships, and then drop markers when they saw something, as well as circle it, which would allow the ships to close in when visibility was good, or when visibility was low or the aircraft was going after something on the horizon or over it, they could use the high-frequency direction finding antenna to take a fix on the aircraft's location, again as long as it remained overhead. The second, reinforced by HMS Woodcock, headed out again on the 23rd of July. This led to an interesting interlude. The Admiralty had declared the operational areas for sub-hunting in the Bay of Biscay to be prohibited waters, and decreed that any neutral vessels found there would be sunk. This was partially due to concerns that the Germans might try to run supplies under neutral flags or set up spy boats, again under neutral flags, but also because the southern portion of the Bay of Biscay was seasonally awash with Spanish trawlers, whose presence would make spotting surfaced submarines very difficult. On the 25th, the first in a succession of Spanish fishing trawlers appeared, apparently completely ignoring the Admiralty's instructions. The second was thus obligated to stop each one in turn, bring the crew aboard, and then sink it with gunfire. The fishermen, for some reason, thought this was a fantastic experience, and a number applied to join the Royal Navy for the duration of the war there and then. Some of their lack of concern was discerned when one captain, asked if he was at all upset about the loss of his ship, revealed that most of this particular fishing fleet was actually owned by a company in Vichy, France, and thus all he had to worry about was claiming hazard pay from his employers and then kicking back for a few days' rest on the sloop's quarterdeck. Eventually, so many Spaniards were enjoying the pleasure of a cruise courtesy of His Majesty's ships that the next big trawler they came across was allowed to stay afloat, loaded up with their temporary guests, and sent home. This brief period of light-heartedness ended on the 30th, when a Liberator radioed that it had found 3 U-boats on the surface. Its position was way out, but a Sunderland and a Catalina that had been attached as Walker had asked to the second fanned out in the approximate direction of the transmission and managed to find the subs again. This time they transmitted back a somewhat more accurate location. Another Liberator relieved the first one, and 2 Halifaxes also showed up, the 5 aircraft circling at a distance and making the occasional attack run, which the 3 U-boats apparently decided to try and resist with anti-aircraft gunfire, coordinating between the 3 of them to remarkably good effect. These were the resupply or milk cow submarines U-461 and U-462, along with the Type 9 U-504. By the time the conning towers were spotted by the second, At about 5 minutes past 10 in the morning, the score was U-462 damaged by bombs and unable to dive, in exchange for which the newly arrived Liberator had been shot up such that it had retired from the action and would eventually either ditch or crash land safely off the Portuguese coast, or slightly on it, some hours later. It depends which account you read. Walker decided that speed now was of the essence and hoisted General Chase, a most unlikely signal for a submarine hunting group, but a welcome one, and the sloops promptly began racing each other to try and get there first. As the sloops closed in, the Sunderland used the attention that was being focused on the Liberator to make an unopposed attack run on U-461, sinking it with a direct hit on the stern. Oddly enough, the Sunderland's call sign was also U-461. Thus distracted, U-462 and U-504 didn't notice the sloops until they started smothering U-462 in shells, forcing it quickly to scuttle after taking repeated hits. U-504 then came under fire, but with a few minutes' grace, thanks to U-462 being the primary target, it managed to dive. Walker quickly boxed the sub in and then moved to attack, although he took additional time to let the chase run through and just past the drifting survivors of the first two subs, instead of promptly setting off hundreds of pounds of explosive right smack in the middle of them, balancing pragmatism with humanity. He would record later, "When I ordered Kite into attack, no one could foretell what effect it would have on the members of the Aryan bathing party who were but a short distance astern, with the whites of their eyes clearly visible. It was a fateful moment, although there was no question of a sword hanging over their heads. Rather was their fate to be decided much lower down." The first attacks failed, so Walker set up his creeping attacks again, and after a couple of passes, a mass of wreckage welled up. Having established that it was definitely the remains of a U-boat and not decoy material, Walker then turned back to pick up the survivors from the 461 and 462, which included an unfortunate engineering officer from U-462 who had been trying to clear the U-boat's deck gun of a jam to return fire when he'd opened the breach and been promptly hit in the face by an empty brass cartridge and knocked overboard with a broken nose. Only 10 of the Type 14 supply submarines had actually been built, and the second and its aircraft had just sunk 20% of that fleet. U-464 had been lost the previous year, U-463 had been sunk in March, and U-487 and 459 had gone down less than a few weeks earlier, which meant that the resupply fleet of subs was now at under half strength, and by the end of the year, only 2 of them would be left. The patrol wrapped up with picking up the rather forlorn crew of an FW-200 Condor who'd run into a Beaufighter 4 days earlier, and then they also picked up what was left of the crew of U-454, which had been sunk in a mutual kill with a Sunderland. But there was to be one last round of excitement. Aircraft sightings seemed to indicate that the Germans, rather fed up of Walker's shenanigans, had dispatched a large formation of Narvik-class destroyers to get rid of them. The Narviks, more properly known as the Type 1936As, were each about twice the displacement of a sloop, and much faster and much more heavily armed. However, the second was riding on something of an adrenaline high, and so instead of running away, they seemed to have concluded that this was obviously just a chance for an even bigger and better kill, and soon battle ensigns were being hoisted aboard all the ships, and the sloops headed off at full speed, planning for a night engagement, heading down the bearing that had been reported by the aircraft. That evening, they almost fell upon the 40th Escort Group, which was doing a job similar to theirs when they sighted their masts, but they managed to recognise their friendlies in time. Belatedly, the Admiralty realised Walker's men were actually serious about this, and, having anticipated potential German destroyer interference, they ordered a cruiser they'd stationed further west to proceed at speed in support of the sloops. But it seems that whatever ships the Germans had sent out apparently thought better of the whole idea during the night, retiring back to port without encountering the second and its rather hopeful 4-inch gun crews. The second then headed home, and at the start of August the Kriegsmarine temporarily suspended operations from the Atlantic ports. By this stage, Starling was back in the water, and so the formation headed back into the Bay of Biscay. But now, of course, it was largely empty of U-boats, which meant that the only excitement came in the form of the rather bizarre behaviour of large groups of Junkers 88s, which would appear, circle outside of anti-aircraft range for a bit, occasionally dart in close, and then fly home again. The only time anything flew close enough to actually be shot at, it turned out to be a low-flying patrol of Mosquitoes who were hoping to catch one of the Junkers 88 formations unawares. Sadly, though, when the group returned from its patrol, heading for Liverpool this time, they were greeted by the news that His Majesty's submarine Parthian, with Timothy Walker aboard, had been sunk, probably by a mine, whilst on operations in the Mediterranean, with all hands lost. Eileen Walker had arrived at the dockside just as the lines were made fast, having heard the news some time earlier and arranged with the Admiralty not to have it transmitted to Starling while it was on active duty. There was the usual swarm of people who had all sorts of urgent matters to discuss with Walker, since he was still Captain D. Liverpool as well, but they found their path blocked by a solid formation of the Second's officers once they'd heard the news. They would later clear a path to a waiting car for their captain and his wife after both had spent some time fully absorbing the news in Walker's cabin aboard Starling. Back in the Bay of Biscay, the close of August revealed what the Germans had been planning. The first support group, along with the destroyers Grenville and Athabascan, were conducting a sweep when 18 German bombers appeared. 5 made an attack run. Each then strangely appeared to split in two, with one half rapidly outpacing the other. It turned out that this was actually the first successful combat debut of the HS-293 guided missile. Athabascan and the sloop Egret were hit. The large destroyer took the blow and staggered, but managed to recover. The smaller sloop exploded and was lost with only 35 survivors from a crew of over 200. The damaged Athabascan picked up those left in the water, while Grenville played dodge the missile, as the rest of the German formation rather inexplicably chose to then fire off the remaining HS-293s singly instead of in a wave, as they'd just done. It turned out somewhat later that the sloop HMS Bideford had actually been hit by an HS-293 a few days earlier, but that missile had failed to explode and thus only caused damage to the ship. Now, the circling with occasional darting in behaviours of the German bombers previously made sense. The crews had been training in the use of this new weapon. Although 2nd Support Group in particular had an unusually heavy anti-aircraft battery for an escort formation, most such vessels did not, and patrols in the Bay of Biscay were therefore temporarily suspended, although the 2nd itself was sent out with some electronic warfare specialists to try and attract an attack. It was hoped prototype jamming equipment could be used to make a missile dive into the water for recovery and examination, but no obliging bombers appeared brave enough to try and take them on, perhaps because of the sheer aggression that the formation displayed whenever bombers were sighted, which, along with the fact they had 6 guns in twin mounts, 2 forward and 1 aft, may have led to their being mistaken for small cruisers like the Arethusas, which would be much more difficult targets and possessed armour plate, which the HS-293 was not really designed to engage. Therefore, the only excitement of that particular deployment was when the group's personal Catalina, on semi-permanent secondment to the formation, was attacked by a number of Ju-88 heavy fighter variants, which resulted in the flying boat making for the cover of one side of the formation, whilst the combined anti-aircraft firepower of the sloops drove off the German aircraft on the other side. A few U-boats would try their luck sneaking along the Spanish coast, but unless they had a direct sighting, the 2nd couldn't just start wandering up and down inside Spanish territorial waters, and so instead they rescued the crew of a shot-down Liberator. Although of the 7 crew who survived the crash, 4 had died as the result of exposure, after having been refused water by a U-boat that they'd encountered shortly after being shot down, 2 passing away before they could be picked up, and 2 more passing away shortly thereafter. This behaviour hardened the attitudes of many in the 2nd Support Group somewhat towards the German submariners. In September, Starling went back into dock for a refit, and the 2nd was reoriented in light of the suspension of the sweeps of the Bay of Biscay. The 2nd was now comprised of Starling, Wild Goose, Woodcock, Magpie and Kite, alongside the welcome shape of the escort carrier HMS Tracker. They sailed in mid-October to the accompaniment of a briefing that covered yet another new weapon. Back in mid-September, while Starling had been refitting, 2 large convoys heading from the US to the UK had merged in the face of over 20 U-boats gathering to attack them. Along with aircraft support, losses had been kept down to a half-dozen merchant ships in exchange for 3 U-boats. But 3 of the escorts had been sunk and another had been damaged. All of them had been hit in the stern. Investigation quickly concluded that the Germans had deployed an acoustic homing torpedo. A quickly invented noisemaker called Foxer was designed to try and fool them, but despite the new torpedo being able to be fired at extreme range, as of course it would do its own course correction, the Foxers that were assigned to the second largely rusted away on deck. Walker, as it turned out, rarely used them, preferring a far more direct approach to give the enemy commander something else to think about than firing their torpedoes. One tactic he proposed was to pretend to be the outer screen of a convoy's escort formation. This would hopefully lure the U-boats into trying to sail around the second, which would of course bring them in closer, enabling Walker's ships to pounce on them more easily. But before they could put any new tactics into practice, they had to survive a Force 10 storm. The formation was making revolutions for 10 knots, but only managing 3. The waves topped 50 foot, and the wavelength of the swells was 5 times the length of the sloops, forcing them on a long and difficult roller coaster ride for days. They couldn't slow down because they'd lose steerage and go abeam of the water, and they couldn't speed up because then the force of the ship smashing through the waves would be too much for the bows. Tracker was caught out by the wind and went over almost on her beam ends, gradually struggling back upright while the hangar crew chased after a pair of swordfish who'd broken loose and were leading the crew on a merry chase around the hangar. This would not be the first time that Tracker was seen wallowing and rolling heavily in the wind. Tracker was equipped with a mixture of swordfish and seafires, the swordfish for anti-submarine patrol work and the seafires to take on long-range German aircraft, but right now the weather precluded their use. Cracked rivets and parting welds bedeviled the sloops, with every cabin springing leaks and depth charges breaking free and chasing each other and the crew around the quarterdeck. The quarterdeck itself was moving worryingly independently of the rest of the ship aboard Starling. Eventually, though, they managed to find convoy ON-207, escorted by the 2nd and 7th support groups and the B-7 escort group. Between them, they could call on the services of Tracker and another escort carrier, Biter, assuming that the sea let up for 5 seconds, and along with the combined 16 escort ships, plus the 2 escort carriers, that was a formidable convoy. But, of course, the weather, as bad as it was for the carriers and the sloops, was even worse for the U-boats, and so the only excitement of that particular mission came when the weather dialed itself back a little bit at the end of October. At least wind-wise, the seas were still quite heavy, and Tracker decided to try flight operations. When one of the swordfish came back to land, it made a textbook approach despite the rolling, only to find at the very last second the entire carrier dropped away into a very deep wave trough, coming back up again moments later to slam into the still descending aircraft, now well forward of the arrestor wires, the impact sending the poor aircraft bouncing over the side and into the sea, although the sloops were able to rescue 2 out of the 3 aircrew. The weather built up again to even fiercer levels on the 1st of November, before finally beginning to blow itself out suddenly on the night of the 5th through 6th, or at least so it seemed. Taking advantage of the relative calm, the crew began bailing out water from so many places it really shouldn't have been, and trying to address the various cracks and splits in the hull plating, whilst the ships themselves tried to regain their formation, which had been abandoned in the face of the storm. The line had just about been re-established when a star shell arced into the sky to port, followed by a signal from Kite. She'd spotted a U-boat, which had promptly dived. Walker ordered Tracker to turn to starboard and take cover behind Wild Goose and Magpie. He wasn't going to have a repeat of Audacity on his hands if he had anything to say about it. He took Starling across the carrier's bows to support Kite. As it turned out, the sub had indeed been gunning for Tracker, and it was only Kite's radar and sharp reactions that had saved the carrier, forcing the U-boat to worry about the sloop instead. Woodcock also showed up a few minutes later, but after a few passes in heavy swells, Walker decided that complex operations in darkness and high seas were far too risky, and instead he configured his 3 ships to box in the sub, maintaining ASDIC contact, and decided to then trail it until daylight. As the sun rose, Starling directed Woodcock to sneak in at 5 knots with her own ASDIC off. She let off a pattern of depth charges into the sea. These were new ones that could go much deeper, whereas the previous versions could only reach 500 feet at the maximum setting. These were set for between 600 and 800 feet, to cover the depths it was now known that U-boats could hide at. A few minutes later, as the rumble of the charges faded, the ASDIC operators heard sounds like a can being crushed in a fist, along with the shearing of metal. U-226 had been fatally wounded and was now passing through crush depth. The boom of the final failure of her hull was heard on the ASDIC, and shortly thereafter something else exploded much closer to the surface, which was followed shortly thereafter by an upwelling of wreckage. Splice the main brace was signalled and the ships began to shake out for the day. But just after 1 in the afternoon, the high-frequency direction finding team picked up the signal of another U-boat, about 20 miles away. Woodcock and Kite were sent off to guard Tracker, whilst Wild Goose and Magpie were heading out with Starling after the contact. Tracker sent up a swordfish, and a Liberator also appeared. Although the aircraft weren't able to hit the sub, they did force it to dive, which in turn obviously limited how far it could go in the time it would take the trio of sloops to reach their location. Walker did some quick calculations and estimations. If he took into account the location that the U-boat had been on the surface, the relative position of the major convoy routes in relation to that, and the fact that the Liberator had shown up out of the west, he guessed that the sub might try to head north in order to try and evade, and then work back its way afterwards. An hour after they reached the dive point, his estimation proved to be correct. Searching to the north of it, Wild Goose signalled that she had a submarine at 1800 yards. Starling went for the attack, but then things took a slightly weird turn. Walker assumed that any experienced sub by this point would try and evade, and so he made his attack run in anticipation of that. The sub, however, just kept its course and speed dead straight, and so Walker's attack missed by a long way. Wild Goose then went in with Starling guiding it in a creeping attack, but then for some reason, the highly experienced Wild Goose only released some of the 26 charges she'd been ordered to, released those late, and at least one of them detonated at a very shallow depth, throwing Starling's gyrocompass completely out of alignment. Tired and stressed, Walker lost his temper, throwing his cap on the deck and stamping on it. The contact then promptly vanished from both ships' ASDIC systems. Walker was in the middle of composing a rather acidic message to Wild Goose when suddenly there was a loud underwater explosion played over the bridge speakers from the ASDIC hut, followed by the unmistakable sounds of a submarine breaking up and oil welling up alongside the middle section of a torpedo. Thus ended the slightly bizarre career of U-842. Walker paused for a moment, tore up the note sheet, and replaced it with another Splice the main brace signal. The weather now decided that it was done being calm, and the storm grew once again, which turned out to be just as well, as a torpedo promptly leapt out of a large wave apropos of completely nothing, and then exploded on the port aft quarter just a little away from Tracker. The sloops did their best to hunt the submarine in question, even though they didn't really know where it was, whilst sailing perpendicular to the rising seas. But it turned out to be a job just to stay afloat, and ASDIC was almost useless amid the noise of the storm. The crack in Starling's stern was bad enough that light could be seen from below decks, and another torpedo was heard heading for Tracker, but it had no better luck than its predecessor. Finally, the weather eased on the 10th, whatever submarine had been hunting them long gone, and the battered second made its way into Argentia in Newfoundland, which was a base that was on lease to the US Navy at the time. The ships were battered, rusty, and with so many popped rivets, jammed guns and hull cracks, It was hard to imagine that the second had left the UK only a few weeks ago looking as if they were fresh out of the yard. With a voyage that Walker described as perpetual paddling for those aboard, the second was glad of the hospitality of the Americans, letting the crews relax while the worst of the damage was patched up. Hull strengthening awaited them back home, and with patching up done, 4 sloops headed off, stopping in at St John's for some shopping in anticipation of getting home for Christmas. Woodcock had been sent home ahead with another convoy as her forward guns and ammunition lockers had been jammed and lost, respectively, to a particularly big wave. Tracker had been detached to another convoy, and so it was Starling, Wild Goose, Magpie and Kite who were directed first to a eastbound convoy that they could escort home, before being redirected to convoy SL-140 far to the southeast. It was already protected by its own escorts and the frigates of 4th Support Group, but even this combined force was struggling against an assault by between 13 and 14 U-boats, who number-wise matched the escorts at a roughly 1-to-1 basis. It would take 3 days of high-speed steaming for 2nd Scouting Group to reach the convoy. They took up one flank and set about chasing Aztec contacts, but with a threat of massed air assault looming and many other submarines in the area, the sloops were on something of a leash, and they had to break off several promising attacks to try and catch up with the convoy again. However, thanks to their intervention freeing up the faster frigates of the 4th Support Group as well as the services of the escort carrier USS Bogue, the convoy managed to make it through without loss. The Wolfpack wasn't so lucky, losing a total of 6 U-boats with another 2 damaged, either in direct attacks on the convoy or in the operations immediately surrounding said attack. The day after 2nd Scouting Group arrived, the submarine assault was thus called off, and the rest of the voyage passed rather peacefully. The 2nd arrived back in Liverpool in early December. They were back in time for Christmas and a long overhaul and repair. Preparations for D-Day, although this was still over 5 months away at this stage, were cluttering up the docks, and the sea lanes needed to be kept clear, because even more men and supplies were coming in to strengthen Operation Overlord. But for the men of the 2nd Support Group, that was all going to be for next year. One slightly tipsy sailor climbed the mast and fixed a small Christmas tree to the radar antenna of Starling as she rested in dry dock. This was met with great approval. His subsequent off-key rendition of some hymn or other was largely lost to the wind, and not met with such great approval. But it was all taken in good humour. For Walker, this was a chance for a short break ashore. But unknown to everyone, the coming year, 1944, would be Walker's last.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.